To define the world of The Hobbit is, of course, impossible, because it is new. You cannot anticipate it before you go there, you cannot forget it once you have gone. The author's admirable illustrations and maps of Mirkwood and Goblin Gate and Esgaroth give one an inkling, and so do the names of the dwarf and the dragon that catch our eyes as we first ruffle the pages. But there are dwarfs, and no common recipe for children's story will give you creatures so rooted in their own soil and history as those of Professor Tolkien, who obviously knows much more about them than he needs for this tale. That is an excerpt from the Times Literary Supplement review of The Hobbit, published October 2nd, 1937, written by one C.S. Lewis, just in case the use of the word inkling didn't tip you off. Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week we begin our journey from the hill to the mountain, all the way there and probably even back again, as presented in the pages of J.R.R. Tolkien's novel, The Hobbit. This is going to be a really interesting project. I have never undertaken quite this kind of project before, in the sense that, yes, I'm reading The Hobbit, which I've done many times. I'm even podcasting about reading The Hobbit, which is certainly something I've done in the past, but I am adopting a new reading strategy this time. And to kind of clarify this right up top, a reading strategy is not an exclusive means by which we interpret the text. It is not a fixed lens. It is simply a bias. It is an inclination. It is a kind of reading which will open up paths previously left unregarded, will open up new perspectives, new vistas, hopefully even new understanding in our movement through The Hobbit. I'm going to frame out some timeline stuff, and then we're going to get to the specifics. Before that, though, a quick word of advisement. You will find everything that I reference in the show notes, links at least to everything that I reference in the show notes. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention three of the books which I'm going to be relying on the most as we move through this series. This is going to be kind of a survey class, in addition to the reading strategy, which I will outline later. This is also going to be kind of a survey class about the state of contemporary Tolkien academia. I think we're going to be looking at basically where the Academy is on Tolkien's work, in particular The Hobbit, right now, as of this moment, and kind of blurred over the last, 40, even 50 years for sure, because the Academy is many things, but Swift is not one of them. The three books that I would most heartily recommend, two of which you might be able to see here right beside me if you're watching the live video, of course, exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit by Professor Corey Olsen, which is really the definitive modern text for anyone engaging in some straightforward close reading of The Hobbit, which is a thing that everyone should do at least once in their lives. It is actually even more than a text about The Hobbit. It really does illustrate and demonstrate the discipline of close reading and the rewards that you can get from taking that approach. Just focusing on the text, paying attention to the words, and then putting them together in a way that yields greater insight, which, for some authors, is maybe a bit of a hollow practice, is maybe, a little speculative, is maybe you're drawing some inferences there. But this is Tolkien that we're talking about, so there is depth there always. It really doesn't matter where you look, you will generally find a richness and a reward to engaging in close reading of this text. So, of course, we are indebted to the work of Professor Corey Olsen. The second book, and possibly the one that is already on your shelf more probably than any other, is, of course, the annotated Hobbit with the commentary by Douglas A. Anderson, which is comprehensive in its approach to highlighting the connections and the references in the text itself. It's a really, really great book. Mine is sitting beside me here. I unfortunately have lost, let me share. In fact, I went to all the trouble of preparing a slide, and now I'm being remiss because I didn't share the slide with you. These are the three books that I'm discussing. This is not the cover of Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit that I have, and I have long since lost the slipcover to my annotated Hobbit. But, the underlying hardback cover is beautiful in its simplicity. The third book that I really want to credit here is The History of the Hobbit by John Ratliff, who undertakes exactly the kind of scholarly work that Christopher Tolkien produced in the History of Middle-earth series, but does it for The Hobbit. It is a really great and engaging and surprisingly light book. It is, for all that it is a history of the manuscripts of The Hobbit and an accounting of the revisions therein, it is a surprisingly readable text. I think that Ratliff is an extremely skilled communicator, as are all three of the authors to whom I'm referring here. All of these are highly recommended. Glorfin David is joining me in the chat tonight. Hello, Glorfin David, on a new show. I hope that you enjoy your time here in Shire Reckoning. Let's come back to my camera view here. I will say, for those of you who are joining me either from my previous Tolkien podcast exploits over on There and Back Again, or my genre fiction show Stars and Swords, which you can find at starsandswords.com, this is going to be much more conversational. It is going to be much less reliant on slides and close reading. I think that I have 6 slides for tonight, and we've already passed one of them. So that's the kind of thing that we're doing. We're not going to be focusing as much on the letter of the text, as much on that close reading that I just described, although there will be moments certainly when we pay very strict attention to what is being said. But hopefully it's going to be a little more conversational and shorter. Hopefully it's going to be an hour long. And in this first session, we might even get out of here in less than an hour. We're going to see how that works out. So let's talk first about the timeline, talk about the production of The Hobbit, and then we're going to specify the strategy that we're going to take. The first piece of work that Tolkien writes that connects to what we understand later as his legendarium, right? The entire massed canonical body of Tolkien's stories. The first of those stories is The Voyage of Eärendil, the Evening Star, in 1914. Tolkien writes that at the age of 22, 6 months before he graduates Oxford and is commissioned into the Lancashire Fusiliers. It isn't until 1917, though, after he has been sent home from the front lines to recuperate from trench fever in Yorkshire, that he begins working on the 3 stories that will become the Book of Lost Tales, that will also simultaneously become the pillars of the legendarium: Beren and Luthien, the Children of Húrin, and the Fall of Gondolin. All of these stories are in play by the end of that year, by the end of 1917. The following year, he's already working on the music of the Ainur, the very first part of the Silmarillion, the creation myth of Arda. The year after that, he's working already on the chaining of Melko and the darkening of Valinor, the early parts of the history of Arda. And he's already stitching these stories together into a unified, comprehensive, encompassing, incredibly ambitious and developed and specific mythology. And some of that specificity is going to fall away, right? At this point in his career, he is still thinking about etiological mythologies for the foundation of England. He's still thinking about these myths being very applicable to the contemporary to Tolkien English experience. Some of that is going to fall away, but the roots run deep. So he continues to work on these stories, making new versions, starting new versions, and then usually abandoning them, changing names and dates and details to make them all better fit together, and to discover these stories through the process of writing them. He's also writing Father Christmas letters and other adjacent works, right? By 1925, now a professor of the English language at Leeds, he's working on major additions and revisions. He's working on the Flight of the Noldor from Valinor, and he's working on the Lay of Leithian, the verse form of the story of Beren and Luthien. In 26, he moves to Oxford, now a professor of Anglo-Saxon. He casually meets C.S. Lewis and writes what is known as the Sketch of the Mythology, which is the first unified version of the Silmarillion, and I hesitate only because it will be superseded almost immediately by later revisions, but it is the first attempt to take basically all of the stories that he has, all of the ideas that he has, and fold them into one contiguous narrative. And when I talk about these stories as belonging to the Silmarillion, I always want to asterisk that by saying, not the published volume that is the Silmarillion, right? Not the posthumous volume that is the Silmarillion, that is selectively prepared and edited by Christopher Tolkien, his son and chief archivist of Tolkien's work. Christopher does a fantastic job throughout his entire academic career curating his father's work. But the selection for the Silmarillion is specific, and it is purposeful in a way that Tolkien's sense of the entire legendarium en masse is perhaps not always so specific, or perhaps not always so narrow. The Sketch of the Mythology, for example, that he produces here is only 28 pages, but it is basically all of history from the start to the end, from the beginning of the music of the Ainur all the way through to the end of the Third Age, more or less. In 1928, Tolkien continues work on the Lay of Leithian, that story of Beren and Luthien. In 1930, in the summer months, Tolkien famously, while grading papers, you know what, let's rather than me telling you the story that you have certainly heard before if you are a Tolkien fan, let's let him tell it himself. In this 1955 letter from J.R.R. Tolkien to W.H. Auden, the poet, quote, "The Hobbit was originally quite unconnected, though it inevitably got drawn in the circumference of the greater construction, and in the event modified it. It was unhappily really meant, as far as I was conscious, as a children's story, as I had not learned sense then, and my children were not quite old enough to correct me, as it has some of the silliness of manner caught unthinkingly from the kind of stuff I had had served to me, as Chaucer might catch a minstrel tag. I deeply regret them. So do intelligent children. All I remember about the start of The Hobbit is sitting correcting school certificate papers in the everlasting weariness of that annual task forced on impecunious academics with children. On a blank leaf I scrawled, 'In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit.' I did not and do not know why. I did nothing about it for a long time, and for some years I got no further than the production of Thror's map. But it became The Hobbit in the early 1930s and was eventually published not because of my own children's enthusiasm, though they liked it well enough, but because I lent it to the then Reverend Mother of Cherwell Edge when she had flu, and it was seen by a former student who was at the time in the office of Allen and Unwin. Interestingly, pedantically, though I am using the standard date here of 1930, which is the year that Tolkien initially asserts to be the beginning of The Hobbit and is then later confirmed, as best as we can confirm these things, by the documentary evidence, both Michael and John Tolkien, the eldest of the two Tolkien children, they attest to hearing about hobbits prior to 1930, previous to 1930. So even this detail is possibly incorrect. This is not to suggest shady business on behalf of the Tolkien family, you understand, just to emphasize that memories are inherently unreliable and stories do change in the telling. The reference here to Cherwell Edge is to a local girls' hostel where Tolkien's student and friend Elaine Griffiths was staying. She showed it to her student, Susan Dagnall, who worked at the publisher Allen and Unwin and who would, of course, later publish it. This doesn't happen, though, until 1936, so we're a ways away in the future. This, of course, is the version of the story that has endured, despite speculation that Tolkien borrowed the word from some other source or miswrote the word rabbit, which is something that Tom Shippey gets into in his 2005 book, The Road to Middle-earth. It is a really interesting and compelling kind of conspiracy theory, but like all conspiracy theories, it basically doesn't hold any water and kind of falls apart immediately. But we can speculate for a moment about how rich the world would be if Tolkien had just casually, in his fugue state after grading all of these papers, had simply written "in a hole in the ground there lives a rabbit" and had misspelled rabbit or miswritten rabbit, paused, looked back at what he had written and said, "What the hell is a hobbit?" I think there's something kind of poetic to that. There is, interestingly, one printed use of the word hobbit prior to Tolkien, and it comes a long way from the past. It comes from the so-called Denham Tracts, a series of pamphlets published between 1846 and 1859 by Michael Denham, an amateur folklorist from Yorkshire in the north of England. In the 1853 printing, for example, Denham includes an exhaustive list of 200 spirits and fairies and supernatural beings, which includes, as you can see here on the slide that I am posting, pygmies, chitterfaces, nixes, ginny burnt-tails, dudmen, hellhounds, doppelgangers, bogglebows, bogies, red men, portunes, grants, hobbits, hobgoblins, and perhaps most regrettably, brown men. It was, the middle of the 19th century, but that still kind of stands out as something that we probably shouldn't include in a list of supernatural beings. So the presence here of the word hobbit, like this unambiguous printed use of the word hobbit, is obviously an evocative detail. It's obviously inspiring to the imagination, and we should note that Denham comes from Yorkshire. The tracts were printed there and were collected in complete volumes there. Tolkien, as I said, spent years in Yorkshire between time recuperating from his trench fever in eastern Yorkshire and then teaching at the University of Leeds in western Yorkshire. So it is not impossible that he read the Denham Tracts and picks up the word, but to my mind, it is just as likely, given the realm of the phonotactic possibility associated with the English language, right? There are only so many ways in which you can take the acceptable phonemes associated with Old English, in this case, and kind of clack them together, right? Like Lego blocks trying to fit them together. There are only so many possible combinations, and it doesn't seem to me implausible that someone could have spontaneously, or that two people could have spontaneously arrived at the combination of hob and bit. Tolkien understood his own neologism. He understood this word eventually, for what it's worth, as being derived from the Old English word holbitla, meaning hole burrower. In the fiction of the Legendarium, that is the translation of the Westron word kuduk, meaning hobbit, right? Which is derived in turn from the Rohanese, the language of the Rohirrim, kud dukhan, meaning hole dweller. The Rohanese, of course, more inclined toward real-life Anglo-Saxon than the Old English derivation. For what it is worth, and I think it's worth a great deal, honestly, the Hobbit English Dictionary, also a very good and worthwhile organization. The Oxford English Dictionary do credit Tolkien as the sole originating point of the word hobbit, though Michael Drout's Tolkien Encyclopedia notes that the editor of the OED in 2003, John Simpson, wrote in a newsletter that The word Hobbit has since turned up in one of those 19th century folklore journals in a list of long forgotten words for fairy folk or little people. You know, one of those 19th century folklore journals. I don't know about you guys, but I cannot move in my garage for the stacks of 19th century folklore journals that I have containing lists of long forgotten words for fairy folk and little people. In any case, 2 years pass from this originating point. Around the end of 1932, Tolkien shows Lewis a typed draft of The Hobbit, which runs up to and ends at the death of Smaug. The following year marks Tolkien's, or the beginning of Tolkien's real involvement with the Inklings, which is obviously such an important and well-documented part of his life. 3 more years pass until early 1936, when, as I mentioned earlier, he shows the draft to Elaine Griffiths, who shows it to Susan Dagnall, who encourages Tolkien to finish the book and prepare it for publication. At this point, Tolkien has published 1 brief work and no novel-length material. So this is exciting. Also, he is, you know, as he mentions in his letter before, right, somewhat impecunious. It's an expensive life being an Oxford Don, and any kind of publication money is welcome. So he finishes The Hobbit. He finally prepares it. We'll talk a little about the textual history of The Hobbit in just a moment. The following year, 21st of September 1937, The Hobbit is published. It is hugely successful. The first print run sells out almost immediately. You can try and find those first impression, first editions out there. You will have to go to a very prestigious auction house to try and find them. I believe that they are running now like £250,000. So it's a significant investment if you want to own one of the, I believe, 1,500 first impression of the first edition of The Hobbit. Tolkien thinks for a moment that this success is surely his pathway to publishing the Silmarillion, to publishing the Tales of the Elder Days, and he is quickly dissuaded by his editor. He is assured that the market is absolutely ready for a second Hobbit book, but probably not this somewhat dry and academic history of the elves and the Elder Days. But that doesn't mean that he isn't thinking about the Silmarillion actively through this whole process. As we've seen throughout, the writing of The Hobbit is both preceded by and accompanied by the writing of the rest of the Legendarium. He is, even when he's in active development of The Hobbit, writing out the stories which surround and inform it. And it might be worth, I guess, sketching out alongside this timeline this history of the manuscripts themselves. I think that this is fairly significant and certainly yields a sense of where he is, right? So this is all taken from the Ratliff. These are the phases that Ratliff has identified as belonging to the production of The Hobbit as a manuscript. So 1930 sees the beginning of the first phase, in which Smaug is called Priftan and Gandalf is called Bladorthin and Thorin is called Gandalf, which is weird. It's only 1 chapter long, and it falters basically immediately, right? That is the text that is immediately preceded by that famous line inscribed on that blank page. The second phase begins in 1932, in which the bulk of the work is done. This is the phase that takes us all the way up to the death of Smaug, and then the narrative falters again, because, brilliantly, Bard shows up. Tolkien was not anticipating the arrival of Bard the Dragon Slayer into his story, and had to stop and consider the implications. He had to kind of reformulate his own worldview. And this is something that we're going to refer back to constantly, I think, as we're discussing this particular perspective on The Hobbit, which is that so much of Tolkien's process is a process of discovery. He describes it himself as a process of discovery, that he is figuring out this story far more than he is architecting this story. He is listening, sure, to his own creativity. He is open to these moments of inspiration. Absolutely. He is open to his own, inclinations, his own inspirations. He's drawing in the influences which are so important to him and combining them into this aggregate mythology for England. But it is also a process which is revealed to him on the page. He is making sense of his story so often as he is writing, as he is drafting. He is making sense of his story in much the same way as we do, in much the same way as scholars of Tolkien's work have now been doing for more than half a century. So he then takes a break and comes back in December of that year, in December of 1932, and completes the story, at least mostly because at this point he is telling the story to his boys, to Michael and John and Christopher, and he concludes the tale. He finishes up the oral version of The Hobbit, if you like, and then apparently kind of loses interest in preparing a manuscript form. The last couple of chapters are sketches. They're notes. They're not properly typewritten. They're not properly typeset. They're just kind of works in progress, which are then rendered complete by the completion of the story, the kind of incidental completion of the story. It isn't until the encouragement, of Susan Dagnall that Tolkien finishes them properly. He goes back and he typesets the last few final chapters, then he goes all the way through the manuscript and writes all of these handwritten notes. Tolkien's handwriting, famously bad, right? So he goes back and he covers this manuscript with typewritten notes and then hands that manuscript to his son Michael to retype the whole thing. Now, two things are important to understand what happens at this point. The first is that Michael had just injured his hand. He had, I believe, cut it rather badly on some glass, so he only had one operative hand with which to type this manuscript. The second thing that we have to understand is that Michael was, by all accounts, an extremely poor typist. So the second version that we get is really not very good. Like the second typeset version of the entire manuscript is really not very good, and we refer back to the first typeset version with all of its handwritten notes far more frequently. That is the version, though, that goes to print. There is, of course, a fourth phase in the development of The Hobbit, which is when Tolkien revisits this book in order to bring it into line with his conception of The Lord of the Rings. This is what leads to the second edition, published in 1951. This is the version that changes Riddles in the Dark, right? That removes the original, quote-unquote, version of the story that Bilbo told the dwarves and Gandalf and replaces it with a more true, more accurate version of the story that repositions both Gollum and the power of the ring. It's an incredibly, famously, like almost axiomatically brilliant bit of self-editing. And it is a phenomenal piece of work to go back and to revise the book so efficiently, so cleanly, so purposefully. Sometimes it is a word here, it is a modification of a phrase here. There are very few instances where we get extended, rewritten parts of even that chapter, and we just tweak a few other things through the book. Like, for example, we take out a tomato and we replace it with a pickle because we don't want new world loan words coming into the text. That's an ongoing battle that Tolkien fights throughout his career. There is, interestingly, a fifth phase that comes along after the publication of The Lord of the Rings. In 1960, Tolkien goes back to The Hobbit to reconceptualize the entire thing, to rewrite the entire manuscript from scratch in the mode and manner of The Lord of the Rings, to kind of elevate it, to lift it out of juvenilia, to lift it out of the realm of children's fiction, and to present it as a mature, purposeful, compatible fantasy story along with the extremely successful Lord of the Rings, of course. The only other text of note, the only other thing that kind of orbits the Hobbit as we move through here is The Quest of Erebor, written between 1954 and 1955, intended for inclusion in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, but left out, and then published later in Unfinished Tales. We are going to jump from the end of The Hobbit straight to The Quest of Erebor, if I have my way here in Shire Reckoning. Once we're done with analyzing this book, my intention is to go straight to Unfinished Tales, to look specifically at The Quest of Erebor, and to see how Tolkien is already thinking about reframing that, and then to move on to the fifth phase too. I think it would be really interesting. Only 3 chapters have been written in the fifth phase, and that account rather brilliantly just kind of falters into unanswered questions. The kinds of questions that we ask too, like, why are the dwarves carrying these musical instruments? What pony is Bilbo riding? Or does Bilbo even have a pony at this point? There are so many of these questions which kind of run through the community of Hobbit readers, particularly in this era of the internet, that Tolkien himself wasn't just mindful of, but was perplexed by, right? Was confusticated by. We'll talk more about that as we go on. So I want to call out 2 quick things here as we move forward before we get to the specifics of our reading strategy. The first is this letter from Professor Tolkien to the Observer. This is written in 1938, following a published letter in the Observer newspaper, kind of just asking some open questions of Tolkien regarding his inspirations and influences. And in the middle of this very long letter, which was not intended for publication, but which was absolutely published, in the middle of this very long letter, Tolkien includes this somewhat definitive and declamatory statement, quote, "My tale is not consciously based on any other book save one, and that is unpublished, The Silmarillion, a history of the elves to which frequent allusion is made. I had not thought of the future researchers, and as there is only one manuscript, there seems at the moment small chance of this reference proving useful." End quote. And then, from the foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, quote, The process had begun in the writing of The Hobbit, in which there were already some references to the older material. Elrond, Gondolin, the High Elves, and the Orcs, as well as glimpses that had arisen unbidden of things higher or deeper or darker than its surface. Durin, Moria, Gandalf, the Necromancer, the Ring. The discovery of the significance of these glimpses and of their relation to the ancient histories revealed the Third Age and its culmination in the War of the Ring. So we see clearly that both in Tolkien's mind as The Hobbit is being published, or in the immediate aftermath of the publication of The Hobbit, and then many years later, long after The Lord of the Rings has been published and is already a success, and he's writing the foreword to the second edition, he is consistent in his appraisal of The Hobbit as, well, if not a part of the larger continuum, and it does seem to be a part of the larger continuum, at least the recipient of all of the influence of the Silmarillion. This is a part of his legendarium, and it is conceived as such almost from its earliest moments. Which brings us to the point, I suppose, of the adventure that we're going to undertake over the next 10 weeks. I don't really want to put a time limit on it, but we'll see how long it takes us. Many scholars, many academics, many critics, all worthies, right, will encourage you to read The Hobbit as a standalone text, as a juvenile text, as a fairy story aimed at children. And if you read it that way, you are going to be delighted because it is an excellent children's book. But all of this history demonstrates that the vast breadth of the Silmarillion, right, again, used here as a shorthand for all the stories of the Elder Days, all of those stories are in Tolkien's mind as he's writing this book. They are consciously used to inform the writing of The Hobbit, and they are discovered within The Hobbit as he progresses through it. So one of the reading strategies that we are going to employ as we move forward is to remember that we begin in the same Shire that Frodo will leave in The Lord of the Rings. To clarify, that Frodo will leave twice, in fact, in the pages of The Lord of the Rings. We're going to read this book as a product of Bilbo's diegetic, in-universe attempt to write a story palatable to, if not intended for, children. How does Samwise Gamgee read this book as it is presented to him in the Red Book of Westmarch, right? When he comes home to Rosie and Eleanor at the end of The Lord of the Rings, well, I'm back, he said, and he opens up the Red Book of Westmarch and he reads, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," right? That is canonically and textually Tolkien's intent in the way that these stories are arrayed. How does he interpret it? What does it mean to him? What does it mean to someone who has stood on the flank of Mount Doom and seen the destruction raging as Barad-dûr falls, right? I want to try and interpret how this book is understood within its own continuity and to understand how we can understand it as a product of these different narrative voices and different narrative perspectives. What are the challenges to this strategy? Can we effectively read it in this manner? What are the advantages, if any, of reading it in this manner? Can we really reconcile the cosmology of the Silmarillion, the history of the Silmarillion, with the story of dwarves and dragons? And though this is, I think, an unusual approach, right? Most people don't read The Hobbit this way, and most people who are in positions of, responsibility won't tell you to read The Hobbit this way for all the reasons that I have outlined. But this isn't just either a search for novelty or an indulgence in sophistry, right? This isn't just self-indulgent. It is a recognition that stripped of its juvenile charm, which is considerable, stripped of those fantastical fairy tale children's story elements, The Hobbit is serious business. There's nothing in the plot that is oriented toward a juvenile audience. There's nothing in the movement of history here. There's nothing in the way in which we see great powers exercised in the world that is oriented around a juvenile audience. We begin with the last heir of this ancient and honorable and noble, but now downfallen dwarven stronghold, exiled from his home, stripped of his rank, his people scattered across Middle-earth into destitution, and he wants to take it back. And the way that that is presented within the book can seem accessible to juvenile minds, to juvenile readers, but the heart of it is the most serious business. So I think that trying to understand both of these things simultaneously will yield some really fascinating insights. Glorfin David is calling out in the chat here, it reads like these details were originally part of world building a mysterious new place and time. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, the idea of discovery, I think, is so crucial to what informs Professor Tolkien's creative output through the long journey of his career, right? It's in part informed by this. I'm talking very broadly here, and I may be exceeding my absolute authority to relate exactly what the professor was thinking and feeling as he was moving through it. But I think that we can see a bias, as I've said before, I think in other podcasts, that we can see a bias within the medievalist mind toward history rather than fiction, right? It is not a desirable thing in the medieval period. In the real medieval period, writing fiction is not a craft that is respected. Right? Having an original story is not worth anything. Oh, you made it up? Good for you. That is, anybody can do that, right? Anybody can make up a new story. Why are you expecting me to be impressed by this? What's impressive is learning. What's impressive is historicity. What's impressive is knowing the old stories and being able to relate them to a new audience. So you see throughout the medieval period these claims to authenticity, these claims to antiquity. And I think that there is something deeply personal to Professor Tolkien. I think that, let me put it this way, I do not think that he is deluding himself into believing that he is really discovering these stories, but I do think that the process of discovery is an innate and authentic part of his creative process, so that there is a sense of wonder. I think you're right, Glorfin David. I think that it does feel transportive in exactly that way. And you know, from the opening quote, even in the publication of The Hobbit, C.S. Lewis, who of course has the inside track, right? Of course, he knows for sure that Tolkien knows more about The Hobbit than appears on the pages of The Hobbit. But I think he's completely right in the review that he wrote for the Times Literary Supplement when he says that you can feel the depth of it, this impression of depth that is consciously important to Tolkien, but also a subconscious or unconscious product of his creative process. I'm fascinated by that. And it's one of the reasons that I think that this reading strategy that we're going to follow, which, by the way, just to separate this out, this is not going to be dictatorial. If you want to follow along with Shire Reckoning and adopt a different reading strategy all your own, please do. And please, please tell me about it. I would love to know all the many varied and wonderful perspectives that are out there. So this is the strategy that I guess I am going to take. It's the strategy that I am going to be emphasizing primarily as we move through the text, but this is hopefully going to be a rich conversation, and I would love to know what you guys are doing as you are reading through The Hobbit again. So all of that aside, I do think that this process of discovery is authentic. I do think it is important, and I do think that it gives us this sense of wonder and both informs this idea that he is both consciously and unconsciously folding the Silmarillion into The Hobbit as he moves forward. I think it's one of the ways in which we can understand the rapaciousness of the legendarium, right? The desire of the legendarium to expand and to consume these other stories. So all of that is to say that my plan for Shire Reckoning going forward is basically to take as much time as we need. It's to leave no path untraveled as we progress forward, but also to try and stay in the here and now of the story. I don't necessarily. Next week, I want to say everything there is to say about Chapter 1 of The Hobbit and everything that you guys have to say about Chapter 1 of The Hobbit, or take several weeks to say everything that there is to say about Chapter 1 of The Hobbit, but I don't necessarily want to jump out to Chapter 8 of The Hobbit or Chapter 9 of The Fellowship of the Ring or, you know, the Akalabeath. I'm not sure that I want to skip around the timeline that much. I do want to focus still. I'm still a close reader at heart, right? That's one of the reasons that Corey Olsen's book was such an effective reading strategy for me, is that I myself favor close reading very powerfully. This is a different kind of discipline that I'm undertaking in the course of this endeavor. So I hope that you'll put up with me if I slip occasionally into pedantic close reading too. So I want to take all the time that we need, but I think we can safely plan on covering a chapter a week as we move through this story. And then, as I say, I want to spend a week at least looking at the quest of Erebor. I want to spend a week at least looking at the fifth phase, the 1960 rewrite, the 3 chapters, and the notes that we have for that. And after that, well, then it's going to be open to you guys. Then there's going to be a Patreon poll, and you can bring to me any Tolkien or Tolkien adjacent text that you like. We can skip around. We can go anywhere you want. You want to study the Children of Hurin? We'll study the Children of Hurin. You want to do the Father Christmas letters? We can do that. Leaf by Niggle? I am 100% here to do Leaf by Niggle. If you want to do the Fellowship of the Ring, 100%. We could do the Rings of Power. I don't know how popular that's going to be, but we can do the Rings of Power. That will be a poll. I absolutely reserve the right to wield my powers of argumentation and rhetoric, to put my thumb on one side of that poll, to encourage you all in a particular direction. But I am your humble servant, and we will see where you guys choose to lead us next after I'm going to guess 10 or 11 weeks, probably, maybe a little more, but we'll see how it works out. I do think that some of those later chapters, by the time we get to Mirkwood, some of that stuff we can cover 2 chapters in a week. I'm not sure there's that much to say in terms of fitting the Hobbit into the scale, the span, into the what am I thinking? The language, in effect, of, the Legendarium in general, and the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion too. And Glorfin David says, leave no path untraveled and no wild things untrammeled. Traveling and trammeling. That's our motto here as we head forward in Shire Reckoning. All of this, of course, a long way down the road. Next week, we're going to begin with the first chapter of The Hobbit and trying to understand, how we approach it as a diegetic story, how we approach it as a voice, as a text written in the voice of Bilbo, as is mediated through the more distinct and elevated narrative voice, as is mediated through the voice of Tolkien. Of course, we'll kind of come back to those conversations, but really to look at how we are to understand what Bilbo is presenting to us of the real Shire in the middle of the Third Age, right before the beginning of the War of the Ring. I think that's going to be a fascinating endeavor. One quick note before we wrap up. Oh, I should say, next week, Tuesday night. We are going to be doing this on Tuesday nights. The Shire Reckoning schedule has been all messed up this week for technical reasons, which were absolutely outside of my control. But I will be putting out the magazine version, I don't know, I need better terminology for this. If you guys have better terminology, please do get in touch and let me know. But the Shire Reckoning Prime episode will go out on Sunday afternoon, and then we will get together on Tuesday evening at 9 p.m. Central. That is going to be as absolutely cast iron regular as I can possibly make it. Tuesday evening, 9 p.m. Central Time, to spend an hour talking about, as I say, the first chapter of The Hobbit. And starting next week, right after that live show, Patreon supporters will be able to join me for a special after show where I will probably pour a drink, and then we can sit around and talk about things that may have come up, maybe some unanswered questions. If I missed something in the chat as the live session was going, maybe we'll be able to just to tangent a little bit more freely in that after show. That is going to be a ton of fun. That's going to be a slightly less formal setting. So if you want access to that, head on over to the Patreon page. That is patreon.com/nextword, where your financial support will be very gratefully received. And you will also get in return so much bonus material, a great deal of bonus material. I have talked extensively about, gosh, I don't even know, so many movies over there already, books as well, all kinds of things over there in bonus episodes for Stars and Swords, my genre fiction podcast, or Don't You Know Me By Now, my podcast looking at the Before trilogy, the work of Richard Linklater, or The Last Star in Hollywood, looking at the filmography of Tom Cruise. I have discussed, I will pick one at random here. I have discussed the 1992 movie Sneakers, one of my favorite films of all time. If you want to hear me talk at length about how good Sneakers is, head on over patreon.com/nextword. If you can't support via the Patreon, then please help spread the word about this new show. We get a very short period of time, thanks to the algorithm. We get a very, just to reference back to Tom Cruise, of course, thanks to the way that the internet works in 2025, we get a very brief window, a very brief opportunity to attract some attention to new podcasts. So if this week you can spread the word, if you can leave a review or a rating, I guess, right? Or better than a rating, a review, and better still, like the gold standard, tell somebody you know in real life. Tell somebody that you like and care about, hey, there's this podcast, and I think you might like hanging out on a Tuesday evening talking about The Hobbit for the next little while. That is going to do it for this somewhat abbreviated. I know I'm coming in at 40 minutes. How often do I come in short of schedule? That's a remarkable thing, but it's been a long week of podcast production. Glorfin David was with me last night for an episode of Stars and Swords, which is closing up the Silmarillion. I guess a more responsible content creator out there on the internet would have included that as a plug, right? If you're interested in hearing more thoughts about Tolkien, I have just spent the last 25 weeks talking about the Silmarillion in depth over on Stars and Swords, starsandswords.com. You can find the podcast there. I think we have 2 more sessions in that series before it too is done. But Glorfin David was hanging out with me last night as we were recording that session. And wow, my voice just fell apart at the end of that. That was like an hour and 3/4, and I had nothing left in the tank, and I can hear it going again now. So that is going to do it for this first inaugural session of I don't know. Are we a fellowship? What is the Shire Reckoning collective noun for folks who are joining me live? I think we need like some kind of gathering, some Council of Elrond kind of euphemism that we can use here. We'll figure it out as we move forward. So join me next week for coverage of the first chapter of The Hobbit. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining me live. Thank you for listening after the fact. I will talk to you all again soon. Until then, take care. Good night, all.